Welcome to the Throttle Up Leadership Podcast. Our theme for 2026 continues. The future of work, meaning is the new money. Because meaning is simply the greatest motivational force on earth. But 68% of the global workforce is disengaged, leaving $9.6 trillion in productivity on the table every year. Gen Z, the canary in the coal mine, is exposing structural failures everyone else learned to ignore, rationalize, or endure. I'm Dr. John Dentico, your host, bringing over 30 years of experience in leadership, strategic thinking, and designing solutions that solve real problems. This podcast delivers boots-on-the-ground intelligence, real conversations with CEOs, fractional executives, coaches, and small and medium-sized business leaders navigating the same crisis, mitigating the talent hemorrhage before competitive viability disappears. We go beyond symptoms like engagement scores and wellness programs to focus on the structural failures beneath them. Frontline intelligence, actionable frameworks, hard truths. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Now let's throttle up and dive into today's episode. Hello again and welcome to the Throttle Up Leadership Podcast. This is your host, Dr. John Dentico. With me this morning is Charlene Deaver-Vazquez. Now, here's an uncomfortable truth about how most organizations manage cyber risk. They run an annual assessment, score themselves against a framework, build a slide that says the program is maturing, and hand it to a board with no way to translate any of it into dollars. Meanwhile, the threat environment has already moved. The report describes a world that no longer exists, and the executives reading it are being asked to make forward decisions using entirely backward data. My guest today thinks that this is a wrong job description for security. Charlene Deaver-Vazquez is a cyber risk modeling expert and the founder of cyberriskmodels.com, where she produces forecasts that quantify risk, model emerging threats, and hand C-suite leaders actions they can actually take. Her IT career spans 38 years, including risk quantification for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, compliance work across multiple DoD and government programs, and public sector engineering and integration roles. For the past 5 years, she has worked to make risk quantification accessible through her writing. A university-level curriculum she builds and teaches and enforces on the stage. I am truly pleased and delighted to have Charlene with me this morning. Good morning, Charlene. How are you?
Good morning, John. Thank you for that.
You're most welcome. So I'll start with my most favorite beginning question, and that is, tell me a little bit more about yourself. Where did you grow up, and what were some of the influences in your early life?
Sure. So I was raised in the South, rural North Carolina. And I think that taught me the value of work. Both my parents, both sides of my family were farmers. So if you didn't plan in the spring and do in the summer, you didn't have in the winter. And so I think that impressed a lot on me, the value of work. And then as an adult, I moved to the DC metropolitan area. And I worked as a secretary, and I was there when personal computers first started coming into the business area. And I remember that. And I remember thinking, wow, what can you do with this? What can you do with this technology? Because you could automate things, and that was very impressive to me. And then I got involved in computers, and I did a lot of corporate work building small networks, global designs for companies. And then later in my career, I moved over to the government side, Department of Defense, and now I was doing more compliance work, making sure that all of the things were in place. Could you verify that? And then finally, as you said, up until last year, had a long-term contract with Nuclear Regulatory, and that was very specifically risk analysis for the agency, not compliance work, but risk analysis, answering for the C-suite questions about risk, whatever the question was. And through that arc of 38 years. It all came back to you have to do the work in order to build a thing to do what you want. You have to do the work. You have to do the analysis to answer the question. So I usually enjoy doing more complicated things, problem solving, to get to the point that I could answer whatever that question was or make that thing work.
Cyber's on the mind of everybody. In fact, a few minutes ago, before we got online, I was watching a YouTube short about the guys who are big into AI and the VC side of AI. And they were talking about, one of them said, if I was a venture capitalist company today, he said, I would build my company, I would do a startup on cyber. I would be a cyber startup company because all the things that are happening right now, the big one, of course, is a ChatGPT 5.6, we think lashed up somehow with GPT-6 and went out and violated, if you will, the Hugging Face website on its own. It was cordoned off from everything and found a way to get to the internet in order to change the way people may look at 5.6 on Hugging Face. So everybody, of course, is thrown into sort of a sense of panic as to how this happened and how it got caught. Apparently, the CEO of Hugging Face said they were using an open source model, caught the violation, and was able to shut it down. So it's a very interesting mix of technologies here, from frontier models to open source models. But anyway, cyber, I'm sure today, is on the mind of everyone. And if it isn't, they're missing a bet. Let me ask you a couple of questions. Let's zero in on some of the things I've already said. Let's name the problem plainly. Most organizations manage cyber risk with annual assessments, compliance frameworks, static assumptions about control effectiveness. Why is that model not just imperfect, but actively misleading to the people making decisions?
Wow, that's a really good question. How much time do we have?
As much as you need.
So let me see if I can answer that briefly. That model was developed at a time when the internet didn't look like what it does now. And what we're seeing is not just a rapid advancement in threat, right? So if you go back the early 2020s, you had the rise of cyber criminals, which didn't exist before. You also began to see at that time period more nation state activity than you ever saw before. And now you add to that all the geopolitical that's been happening recently, and you add to that the AI piece, and that's just an accelerant. So that model is out of date because the environment has shifted and changed in a way that it could never have conceived. That was created, built around compliance for things that primarily happen in the finance industry that shouldn't have happened. And so it was government's way of trying to put some controls on how businesses were operating. That's not the threat environment that we're in today. Now, I want to pick up on something that you said about this ChatGPT and the breakout and all of that. What a lot of people think about AI is wrong. They think that it is somehow smarter than we are, and that they should just trust it, and that somehow it's going to grow conscious and have these ideas on its own. And so I'm very clearly going to say it's not. At its core, it is an algorithm called Bayesian algorithm, and that's the math behind how people learn. It is the core of a lot of the work that I do. It is core to, language learning, all of that. And the problem is when you use this algorithm, you open the opportunity to all kinds of decisions being made. And so when we see the use of AI go awry, rather than blame the algorithm, I would say it's the responsibility of whoever's managing that AI to understand that concept and put the proper controls in place. Now, an example you're talking about, there actually was a connection for it to get out of that enclosure, and they had given it a task to do, and it was doing that task in a way that they just didn't think about that it would break. And this idea of using AI, we're not going to get away from this, right? It's a business use that if you're not adopting it now, you're going to be behind everybody else. So there's no way the cat's out of the bag. There's no way you can come back and say, oh, we're not going to adopt AI. You can't do that. It's too powerful for business. Just like automation was back in the day when we were first doing things with computers, this is that on steroids. It's just too useful for business not to adopt. But the problem is people don't put the rails on and they trust it too much. And you've seen this in Deloitte, maybe at the beginning of the year, or the end of last year, produced a report and sent it out. They had to pull it back because they hadn't checked it, right? You can't trust it. I tell people like this. Any AI you're using, think of it like it's an intern. It comes in with a great deal of capability, but if you don't tell it what you want, if you don't watch over it, if you don't check it, then the output that isn't what you wanted, that's on you. That was your responsibility, right? It's not the algorithm. The algorithm is going to run. And because it has the opportunity under Bayesian to make any of these choices, there's always going to be some probability that it's going to choose a choice that you didn't think, like lying to you.
Yeah.
Right? It's going to do that because it's built in. It is a possibility for it to do that. And sometimes that possibility is going to surface. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense. Yeah, I absolutely agree. The other thing that people don't understand, and again, my previous guest, Dr. Errol Brand, whose podcast I released yesterday, we started to talk about tacit knowledge and intuition, which, as far as I know, AI does not have. It does not have intuition, and it doesn't have a storehouse of tacit knowledge. And I was talking about a guy named Gary Klein who wrote a fabulous book called Sources of Power. And Gary talks about what's called RPD, recognition prime decision making. And it comes from living in the world, seeing the same thing. If you're a firefighter and you've been there 10 years, well, no one has to tell you or create a list for you as to what needs to be done. You intuitively know that because your storehouse of knowledge, your tacit knowledge is there. For a police officer, for a nurse in a hospital, they know this because of the experience that they built. It's there. And that's one of the things that AI truly misses. Now, it can do some really cool things, don't get me wrong. And I use it a lot. Sometimes I can't find the words for expressing a particular idea and will help me find those words. It kind of understands my voice, but it's getting even more sarcastic than me at times, so I have to kind of rein it in. But anyway, I absolutely agree with you, and we have to be careful with it. I tell people all the time, my workload has not decreased using AI. It's increased because I'm back and forth with it, trying to, flesh out the real sense that I'm trying to get across. So I absolutely agree with you. Let me ask you this question, because this is also right up there in the things that I'm very concerned with. I want to talk about open source models. Let's zero in on the essence of cyber: safety, security, privacy. The open source models are proliferating at a remarkable speed, and organizations are now running capable AI inside their own walls, sometimes without security ever being consulted. From a forecasting standpoint, how does that change the expected loss picture on both the attacker side and the self-inflicted side?
That's interesting. So if I'm building a forecasting model, I'm going to first look at a couple of characteristics, those variables that I'm going to consider to build out the forecast. The changes in these variables are what are going to drive the outcome. So the difference in open source and some of the others, in order to improve a product like AI, you have to do a lot of training of that model. And what's the data that you use? How do you train it? Training a model is complicated, an AI model, because you train for one thing, but that's not really what you get when you put it out in the world. It functions differently, but that's how you have to train it. So if open source could provide the same structure, if those communities could provide the same structure and earmarks and follow-up on the process, then that would be a good thing. That's the whole idea of having something that's open source, is that you have community-driven and that's going to produce better code and that's going to give you a better outcome. But compared to that with some of what's coming of other, non-open source environments where you've got Microsoft building some stuff in Copilot, you've got all of these others that have deeper pockets and deeper research and can probably move faster. I don't know, to try and build something that would forecast that. But your question is really more about the risk of one versus the other, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So let me just
go ahead.
let me just amplify this a little bit. When I think of open source right now, of course, we have Kimmy K3 to just hit the streets and it's get everybody on fire, all about running around in this open source model. I think 1.2 trillion parameters, this kind of stuff. Apple, who's, in my opinion, is playing the long game, building the hardware to actually host these new open source models. I mean, they're talking about a Mac Studio in 2028 that have 1.5 terabytes of RAM in it. And people's heads are exploding as to how can you do that? And when I talk about open source, I really am not talking about, I am talking about open source today, but I'm looking at open source between 2028 and 2030, because I think what the Chinese models have done, whether they intended to or not, is they kicked the door open for open source development in other countries. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. When Mythos was pulled back because of the security concerns about how rapidly it could find 0 days, and then China released this right after that, you have to take that seriously. We're at a pivot point of the use of AI for malicious purposes and how effective it can be. So picking up on something you had said earlier about the changing environment and risk. So part of what I see when I do these analyses that I do, which are sector level, so I look at sectors, industries, and forecast what's going to happen in that industry. And that's based on what we see happening in the last 30, 60, 90 days. So in this case, the characteristics I'm looking at are actual events for forecasting what will happen next. And there's a consolidation of pressures that are measurably causing the security controls we have in place to not function as we would think. In other words, there are AI attacks that bypass all the perimeter security. They're so perfect, there's nothing for traditional security on the defense perimeter to pick up, right? So it passes right through. We see this a lot in the banking area and in fraud. So it's not just you would have one business email compromise that would result in a financial transaction occurring, that fraud event occurring. You have it happening by the hundreds. And that's where the real risk you were talking about in the environment, the real threat of some of these is coming, because they don't just speed it up a little bit, they speed it up beyond exponential. Instead of moving at that sort of pattern, it jumps. And that's what we're seeing happening when you're talking about these kinds of models coming out, especially when you see it come from someplace like China.
Yeah.
Because they're not going to sit on it and not use it.
That's exactly right. And of course, they're trying to, in some way, I believe, counter their demographic issues with technology, because they just don't have the people, the younger folks coming along. So I think in their mind, they're trying to fill that gap with the technology. I want to move a little bit. I would add
one other thing before we move away from it. So now that we brought up the risk environment, the types of threats that AI is doing, and the fact that, China has theirs, we pulled Mythos back because we were concerned. Instead of just looking at a rapid progression attack against business, we have to understand that cyber is now part of the war platform. It's part of that domain. Up to this point, hostile nation has had the nerve to pull the trigger using AI in a way against public sector. They just haven't had the nerve. There's usually 3 or 4 levels of aggravation, we'll call it, that they have engaged with on the war front. And historically, we've seen the hostile nation attacks more against critical infrastructure. But we are at a pivot point, and we are coming to a place where, especially in the finance industry, we could easily see an attack that would destroy the trust in the data in an entire sector or an industry. So think finance, think mortgage, right? Or banking data. If you reached a point that you couldn't trust that data, you've really accomplished something against your opponent in doing that. That's all possible with AI right now. They just haven't pulled the trigger. Right now, that data is more valuable for the extraction. At the point that that ceases to be true, they may be ready to pull the trigger. That's the risk that we see. They're not using AI to go against traditional critical infrastructure. We're seeing it more in public sectors.
Yeah.
Finance, healthcare.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, but here's the thing. If I take the next logical step in the thinking process of the use of AI, I can't help not considering the evolution of open source models used by companies that are trained, are vital, and are stored on their own systems, although those systems could be attacked, no doubt about it. But where they have built some level of trust within the ability to use that model to do finance or healthcare. I mean, it's in a sense, and this is something I taught when I was in the military, it's a defensive posture with an offensive mindset. So in a sense, you're building a defense around it, but yet you're doing it in a way to maintain a set of pushback on anything that might be coming your way. I'd like to have any comments you might have about that.
So I agree. If we don't begin using AI for the defensive mechanism, there's no way we're going to keep up with what's coming. And there are agencies out there, and there are organizations and companies that are doing that. I talked a couple of weeks ago with a vendor that's trying to closely with Microsoft, for example. You have it's at that speed. It just has to be at that speed. But the counterpart to that is AI is so smart, and there's no indicator in the traffic pattern, right? There's nothing there to pick up on. If we don't fall back on leadership for making strategic changes in how they function in the business, we're not going to survive this. So I've been having conversations with executives about, are they planning for that eventuality? Are they looking at what happens when this hits, when this fails, when you have that attack? So in healthcare, they go back to manual systems. When it comes to fraud, how do you handle verifying, transactions that are happening at wire speed? But that's really what you would need to do to stop this. So it's like being in an arms race, and there's no way to tell at this point who's really going to win.
Right.
But the first severe blow that hits large scale is going to be devastating.
I agree. And you brought up the subject of leadership, and I want to go down that road, being the leadership guy that I am as well. So, because I've thought about this, I've thought about it a lot. And I tell people, you're going to sound crazy when I say this, but I'll say it. I've told people that I have been waiting over 30 years for this moment in time, because the traditional leadership models of leadership invested in one individual do not have the ability to scale past that one individual. You got what you got. If this is the person who's in charge and they're driving the train, that's what you got. I have always looked at leadership, at least for the past 30 years, as a process, the process of leadership, that anybody can become involved in it Anybody can be a contributor. My model of leadership, as I've said so many times on the podcast before, is based on one simple idea, and that is contribution. We have a problem, we have an issue. Who can jump in here and give us a hand? And now that a 26 or 27-year-old individual can get on any one of the frontier models or even local models and know more about the organizational dynamic by, or any company, by just, searching and working the algorithms, presents a wholly different problem than knowledge being possessed only by the senior person in the organization. Now knowledge is diffuse. So, and this is something I worked on actually yesterday, and it had to do with AI adoption. And I found this paper. I'll send the link to you. It's a very interesting paper that was talking about AI adoption. And it was focused on 7,600 private companies. Okay, well, let's just talk about the private companies for a minute. That AI adoption is tied to the ability of those AI companies to rearrange or rework their structure, their internal structure. That it wasn't just a managerial issue. We're trying to manage this thing from the top. No, you have to change the structure based on hiring. And this was all based on hiring, this particular report. That it's going to move, it's going to morph, if you will, into a different organization based on who's hired and how the impact of the technology, which means those companies have a great deal more of agility, I would say, and flexibility. Now, I know the federal government well, and you know the federal government well, and they're restricted by statutes and laws. I mean, it's just the way it is. And I think the problem, the leadership inflection point is, can they, and I'm going to toss this fireball over to you in a minute, can they figure out a way to build a level of agility and response into the framework that allows them to move as the threat moves, if you will, not play catch up, because catch up is a losing game. You have to be in front of this problem to the greatest extent possible. And so I would like to get your perspective on, can they do it, and would they do it, and do they need to do it?
So I would start with, do they need to do it? And I would say that's going to be a yes, because as we have younger generations coming up through these agencies and business in general, they want responsibility. They want to be able to have an impact. So using this shift to this structure you're talking about is going to be a win-win for that. Federal, and more so than state, federal has a problem getting people and keeping people. So that would be a win for them on that respect. But will they do that? There is not only such inertia that has to be overcome from the hierarchical structure. So when anybody goes into the federal government, the comparison, I just had a conversation with a CISO yesterday about this. The comparison is, in federal government, you want to find a seat and sit down, is how this person said it, right? You're going to stay there for a while. And when you do that, the perks that you get as you stay there longer are, kind of measurable, and you don't want to give those up because you were there for 5 years to get that office in that location or whatever the perk is. It's just the reality of how it works. But if they don't overcome that, then I agree with you, they're going to have problems. But there's not a lot of initiative for them to do that now. I think it's in a transition state, and maybe in a couple of years you'll see more of that happen, as people either continue to leave or age out of the federal government and other pressures come to bear. But I don't think it's inherent that that's the way that they think consistently now. And the other thing is, they're a really different dynamic. Funding all comes, through Congress. So they don't have the same response to things that industry has, because there's a wall between them. they're not going to get shut down. It's kind of the mentality. You're not going to do away with this because this thing over here happened. We're going to keep running. We're in necessity. So you'd have to overcome that inertia too, I think. But I like the idea. I would love to see that.
Oh, yeah, I would.
I think it will be a lot more benefit. And I think certainly in the private sector, applying that kind of management style, you're right, it makes them far more agile. And they come up with things much quicker, and they become a stronger organization entirely because of that, a tighter organization.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree. In fact, I'm glad you made those comments about the younger generations, Gen Z. I just published my field manual. I did some research, pretty good research on it, called Canaries in the Coal Mine. The workforce crisis Gen Z is exposing. And everybody likes to pick on Gen Z. Oh, well, these guys, these younger generations. Yeah. No, they're the diagnosticians. They are the canaries telling you that the mine is toxic. And it's been toxic for all the generations, for the boomers, for the millennials, for the Gen Xers. It's been toxic. We just put up with it. Gen Xers found a way around it. They, as you say, you just deal with it because especially you get lured, not in a bad way. I don't want to say that in a bad way, but you get lured into the perks that you accumulate working in the federal government. Oh, wait a minute. I went from GS-12 to GS-13, step 6. Oh, cool. I get this other office. I got these folks working for me. And you get this comfortableness. And it reminds me, let me just say it this way. It reminds me of when I wrote my first book, when I wrote Throttle Up, How to Accelerate the Impact of 21st Century Leadership. I ended the book with a quote from a gentleman by the name of John Boyd. And John Boyd was a fighter pilot in the United States Air Force. Today, he's recognized as one of the geniuses of military training, maybe the greatest American military strategist that's ever lived. He only made it to colonel because he had a tendency to piss off most of the generals, because most of the time he was right about things and they didn't want to hear it. But he did have a couple of people of high rank that did support him. And I was talking to someone last night, as a matter of fact, and I mentioned this. I said, Boyd makes this statement, and I think it's so true even today. He said, as a human being, you have two choices. You can be somebody, or you can do something. And Boyd chose to do something, which gave rise to things like the OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, and act. These were how you thought about air combat. He was one of the original Top Guns, but in the Air Force, they call it red flag. So he was one of the original fighter trainers. He was just a brilliant, genius guy. If we endure an attack, a significant attack on the AI scale, we're going to have more congressional investigations, and we know what we're going to do with, how did this happen? Why weren't we ready? All this kind of stuff. But it's not necessarily anyone's particular problem as much as it is a bureaucratic structural problem, because the bureaucracy works a certain way, and that's just the way it is. So it's going to be a very interesting dynamic to see where we go in the future with how even the federal government might change. Go ahead and take it.
So I want to add to that. You're absolutely right. And the bureaucracy part, I want to pick up on that, because in every industry, just about every industry, right now, cyber is increasing and the threat levels are rising, and they're responding with publications and guidance that all goes back to the same basic controls we talked about in the beginning that are out of date and becoming ineffective because AI bypasses. Because that's all that they know and have to give for advice. It comes back not only things like open source development and community-driven efforts to integrate AI more into the perimeter stack and into the products to try and move at the same speed, identify at the same speed, and reduce the time to live in the environment. But I think it also goes back to leadership. Individuals, businesses, CEOs, the C-suite need to realize they have to act on this. You can't just leave this to the IT department to, continue to recommend whatever the top technology is. We have to be thoughtful and consider how we're going to deal with this threat and what actions we're going to take. And that comes from leadership. You can't put that on the mid-level managers and the low-level IT. You can't. You have to lead from the top. You just have to. And this is a moment that I don't know how people are going to respond to, but I'm curious. I'm eager to see how industries and how businesses are going to think through this problem. We've never seen anything like this before, how they're going to think through this problem and what they're going to do to become agile and responsive and resilient, how they're going to allow their businesses to survive. And that's different than it has ever been before, because it's not going to be if you have an attack, it's how many can you withstand.
I absolutely agree.
Right.
Yeah, and please understand, there are many private companies who are behind the curve too. They've got this mentality of, let's hope the bullet misses me, because they're not geared to being proactive. They're in a reactive mindset, and bureaucracy has built react. We still use it today to organize most organizations. And yes, it's a structure. And yes, we need structure. But the metaphor I use is, think of any sport that has lines, a field, and rules. Okay? So those are the guardrails. So football, for example, you have lines, you have refs, you have rules, and that's okay. I get it. But what companies have to understand is, even though those rules exist, even though those lines exist, there are times when you can witness spectacular creativity on the field. Just the things that you say is, how did they do that? That's just amazing. So within the confines of the rules, you can do very creative, forward-thinking kinds of things. And I look at, bureaucracy now, when you really start to kind of pull these two things apart as being the guardrail backstop, more for me, the legal environment. When something goes wrong, for example, someone's a thief in a company. Someone creates a significant issue of sexual harassment, for example. You need structure in place to say, we'll deal with that. There has to be a process that we're going to use to investigate and find out what's going on and get the guilty party dealt with. But other than those kinds of things, you need to allow the creativity to occur. You allow the contributions to come in and bring people into the process, in this leadership process. That's sort of the way I see how we can keep those two things together. I'd love to get your reflection on that.
Well, I love the way that you phrase that, you have to have a plan in place. And there are many leading voices in the industry right now trying to say to business, this is what executives need to do. You need to stress test your environments. You need to know exactly how you're going to respond to all of these things that you don't want to think about. You have to have a plan in place so that you can execute it immediately, because you no longer have the luxury of time the way that you did before. And the organizations that do that well will come out far better than the ones that don't.
Right.
The ones that don't are going to look like they don't know what they're doing. They're going to flounder, and they're going to have a lot more questions. They're going to lose a lot more as far as respect among their clients and vendors. But those who have a plan and step out boldly immediately are going to look much better. Even if, the impact is still severe, they're going to look much better and they're going to fare much better. Especially when it comes to legal ramifications, because they're prepared.
I absolutely agree. And it is why I've been a lifelong supporter of realistic simulations. There is nothing, in my opinion, that can get you closer to preparedness than realistic simulations. The military has done it for over 100 years. I did this myself when we would crawl around on the deck or crawl around on floors and throw 10-sided dice, moving little ships on masking tape. I mean, the basics, there was such an elegance to it. Because why? Well, we had 15 or 20 or 25 people in the same room discussing back and forth. What happens if this happens? just the mindset, the mind thinking of it. Now we've kind of transmitted that all to things like AI and gaming and online computer gaming. But we've been doing that stuff for years. I mean, if you look at the game of chess, it's a game of strategy. You look at the Asian game of Go, that's a strategy game, two different strategies. Fundamentally, the basics for the war in Vietnam, we use chess and the Vietnamese use Go as the way to think about how they might come to the battlefield. So it's a very interesting dynamic. I absolutely believe in simulations.
I'm going to step in here and say, you saw through the eyes an industry that was prepared and had the mentality of defending itself. That is not what typical business, how they view this. And their view of incident response in most cases is not what it needs to be. They're doing an annual review. Maybe they'll do it twice a year. And they're doing roundtable discussions. They're not stress testing it. They're not really digging in, which is what you're talking about, and really finding out what breaks in our processes and procedures. Who has the responsibility to make that decision? What if they're not there? Then what? Those are some of the breaking points that if business would focus on that, it would really be a tremendous help in moving them forward in the ability to respond quickly, which is what they're going to need to be able to do. So it's great, this mindset, military has. If business would just adopt that a little bit, then that would be beneficial to them, because that's kind of the mindset they need to have. And I don't see many of them being really there. Not. They're too wrapped up in trying to run the business or do the thing that they're doing, especially places like healthcare. They're just not there. And that's an area where they really would benefit. So I'm happy to have this conversation and kind of put that out there.
I agree. I could tell you that I had a couple of times in my career, my consulting career, I got contacted by a couple of companies that said, we're very interested in your simulations. And when I explained to them that I was going to use the real data of their organizations, that I would interview people, find out what the real problem was, and then we would build a simulation on that, I never heard from them again. I walked away.
Afraid of what would happen.
Yeah, because, well, here's the thing.
Okay.
They didn't want one organization. The problem was the CEO, who kept sending mixed messages to the people in the organization, and they were just miffed by what he was doing. When I said, I wrote a 4-page report, I sent it to the woman who was the director of HR. They didn't want to know. They disavowed my existence on the planet because I was going to make the CEO look bad. Well, yeah, maybe. Or maybe the CEO could say, maybe this is really great input. Maybe I need to see how I can do a little bit better in that. But no one wanted to touch that. It was radioactive. That report was radioactive. And no one wanted to talk about it. Go ahead.
So this brings up a really interesting point when it comes with dealing with C-suite executives. There is a bias. If there is anything that is uncomfortable or they don't understand, you will get crickets and pushback. So you're exactly right. And I've seen so many analysts try to have this conversation. And in the industry, we talk about the conversation that CISOs are supposed to have with the CEO and the CIO. That transition from technical to business, if that isn't done well, just like what you said, it goes nowhere. It goes crickets. It just falls down. You never hear of it again. You get that pushback. And I guess that, again, why I keep kind of saying, there's a responsibility, leadership here. It needs to pick up. And in many cases, it's not going to be comfortable.
Right.
And it's going to be difficult.
Yep.
And unfortunately, there is that pushback. And I'm not really sure, I don't have an answer for how you overcome it. I know how I overcame it in my work environment and how I got around it. You just have to simplify things. You have to really focus on speaking their language and then let the rest of it come. You can't give them everything all at once.
Yeah.
You have to make the connection, make that initial insight, then you have to build on it over time. But it's very hard.
Yeah. I think my personal feeling is many of these companies who don't do the stress testing, who don't actually try to take on the challenges, won't be around.
I agree, and that's my fear. I agree.
They won't be around. Or they can witness something happening to one of their similar companies and, pain is a wonderful motivator, and say to themselves, you know what? I don't think I want that to happen to me. What do we have to do? How do we get a stress test? What does that look like? Those kind of things. So it's very interesting. So I think we are doing pretty well on our interview here. So I think we're getting close to the end. It's been a wonderful conversation. We are of like minds and of like spirit, and I really appreciate that. So I wanted to ask you the last question, if I could. What does the future hold for you? Where do you see yourself and your work now and going into the future?
So I have often said over the years that I educate around risk quantification because you can answer questions using this that you simply cannot answer any other way. It's like having a crystal ball. It allows you to look forward and see things that you could not do in another way. But I've come to learn that is really, really, really hard. So my goal for the future, where I see myself, is more data delivery, producing the reports that allow the executives to then make the decisions they need to make.
Well, I wish you the best of luck. I'm not giving up. I'm pushing hard to try to get people to understand that structural changes are necessary. In my field book, I talked about three things. I talked about values alignment. What are people looking for? The younger generation, values alignment. They want to have an impact. We call it personal agency and growth trajectory. I'm starting here. Where do I go from here? What kind of training program?
Yeah.
And I think that unless organizations really get their arms around the structural changes that need to be made, they're going to be always playing catch up. They're going to lose the great people that can help build their organization and suffer and may, in effect, other than a government, which could, withstand a lot of this pain. But as you say, they're not attracting and retaining the right folks, the people they need. They're going to be hurting. But anyway, we'll see what the future brings. This has been a wonderful discussion. I can't thank you enough, Charlene. I really, really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for having me. I've absolutely enjoyed this.
Oh, great. Glad to hear it. And I wish you all the success, you and your company, all the success in the future. Thank you so very much for your time.
Thank you.
This is Dr. John Dentico. Remember, meaning is the new money, but it requires building the structures that deliver it. If today's conversation challenged your thinking or gave you a framework worth implementing, share it with a leader who needs to hear it. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and visit throttleupleadership.com for more resources. Until next time, keep throttling up and keep the people at the center of everything you do.